hostage crisis took place on November 4, 1979, when a mob of over 300 students overtook the American embassy in Tehran, Iran. They captured 66 U.S. citizens and held 51 of them hostage for 444 days. The students released women and African Americans because they felt that women and minorities already suffered the oppression of American society. This left 53 United States citizens as hostages, including 2 women, Elizabeth Ann Swift and Catherine Koob, and 1 African American, Charles Jones. The Iran hostage crisis absorbed more concentrated effort by American officials and had more extensive television coverage and press coverage than any other event since World War II. The crisis was also the most dramatic in a series of problems facing Americans at home and abroad during this time. It all started in 1953 when the CIA staged Operation Ajax, which overtook the Prime Minister of Iran and replaced Iran's Shah or monarch. This also created an agreement between Iran and the U.S. that stated that in exchange for military and economic aid to Iran, the U.S. would receive a continuous supply of oil. Ever since oil was discovered in 1908, Iran had attracted great interest from the West, and in earlier years, the U.S. stayed mostly on the sidelines. But the Iranian people became very angered, and the masses were stirred to revolt when the Shah's wealth grew, and he promised his people increased personal freedoms and other social reforms which they never received. As a result, the Shah was forced to leave the throne, and he then left the country. A new ruler came into power, who preached highly against the American government. When the Shah was diagnosed with lymphoma, he was treated by U.S. doctors. This greatly enraged the Iranian people, and they immediately stormed to the American embassy in Tehran. This was when the students laid siege on the embassy and took 66 United States citizens hostage. At first, it was very unclear who they represented or what they hoped to achieve. A similar mob had done the same thing 9 months earlier, but only holding the American ambassador hostage for a few hours. President Jimmy Carter immediately took action and got the hostages released. Carter decided that military action was too risky, so he tried to build pressure on Iran through economic sanctions. He first canceled oil imports from Iran. Then he removed many Iranians from the U.S., and lastly, he froze about $8 billion of Iranian assets to the U.S. Carter began several strategies to free the hostages, but they all failed. The Iranian government denied that they had any knowledge about the crisis, but yet they failed to take action against the hostage takers. In February of 1980, Iran issued a list of demands for the release of the hostages. They demanded the Shah's return to Iran, an apology for American involvement in Iran, and a promise that the American government would stay out of future Iranian affairs. President Jimmy Carter refused to meet those demands. Later that year in April, Carter organized a secret mission to rescue the hostages. The operation was named Eagle Claw. Tehran was surrounded by 700 miles of desert on all sides, and the city was filled with 4 million people, so the plan seemed doomed to fail. The embassy itself was huge and well guarded, and the mission was to be a 2-night process that required a minimum of 6 helicopters and several C-130 cargo aircraft. Just to be safe, 8 helicopters were prepared for the mission. The mission began. Once inside Iranian borders, one helo had to turn back due to operating problems. One helo after another fell to a swirling dust storm. The mission was aborted. Due to miscommunications, one helo lifted off, but the storm slammed it into a C-130, which created a giant fireball that killed a total of 8 people. The Iranians later found out that about the wreckage, and they paraded about it on national television. The U.S. was completely humiliated. In protest, Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State who had opposed the mission, resigned. After the Shah's death in July and the invasion of Iran by Iraq, the Iranians began to reopen negotiations for the release of the hostages. In the late stages of the presidential race, Carter could have bargained with the Iranians, which may have won him the election. But when the Carter administration failed to bring the hostages home, Ronald Reagan won the election. On January 20th, 1981, just minutes after Reagan's inauguration, the U.S. released almost $8 billion in Iranian assets, and the hostages were released. Their agreement also gave Iran immunity from lawsuits concerning the incident. In 2000, former hostages decided to sue Iran under the 1996 Anti-Terrorism Act, which permits U.S. citizens to sue foreign governments in case of state-sponsored terrorism. Iran did not offer an offense, so they won the lawsuit by default. But the U.S. State Department dismissed the lawsuit because they thought that it would hinder its ability to negotiate international agreements, and the federal judge ruled that the agreement that resulted from their release excluded awarding any damages. That was the last of the crisis, and no other lawsuits were ever filed against Iran. The U.S. had battled terrorism in many different incidences, and the Iran hostage crisis was one of them, along with the Oklahoma City bombing and 9/11. The Iran hostage crisis was just the start of the United States' fight against terrorism.